Welcome back to Black News Tonight. A 16-year-old athlete in Durham, North Carolina was forced to remove her hair beads during a game. Nicole Piles thought she had tucked her hair away, but after 2 complaints, the umpire told her the beads violated the rules. The National Federation of State High School Association prohibits student athletes from wearing hair beads, bandanas, and plastic visors on the softball field. When given the choice to remove the beads or stop playing, Piles said she was forced to cut her braids. While Piles says it made her feel disrespected and singled out, the NFHS says the rules are to ensure the safety of the athletes. This story is just one of many that we've been hearing about when it comes to hair discrimination at schools and in the workplace and everywhere else black folk be. So joining me now to have this conversation is Angela Onwuachi-Willig. She is professor and dean at Boston University of Law, and Akiba Solomon, the co-author of How We Fight White Supremacy. Angela, I'm going to start with you. What's your initial reaction to this story when you hear it?
Well, my initial reaction is that this sort of falls in with the way in which hair-based race discrimination occurs, is that usually there is some kind of rule and there isn't very clear why the rule was established, right? And no one is looking into whether there's bias that's underlying underneath the rule in terms of what's prohibited and what's not prohibited. There's a certain arbitrariness to what was prohibited in this particular rule and what's allowed, right? So on the one hand, beads aren't allowed, but clickers and barrettes are allowed. And so then you start to ask yourself questions about who's wearing particular things and why were particular things targeted. And so my first question was, I want to know more about the explanation about when they say this is to protect the safety of the players, what do they mean? And why is this protecting safety versus another potential ban that didn't occur in this case?
You know, Angela, I'm going to ask you a follow-up on this just because, you know, for the last couple of weeks, we've been having these critical race theory debates. And I hear how much the right says, you know, critical race theory is like the devil. But this seems like an opportunity to really think about a situation where a law, or in this case a rule, can be facially neutral but have a disproportionate or disparate impact on people of color, or that there was this idea of color blindness, right? The rules is for everybody. Nobody can have beads in their hair. But we know, sure enough, Becky ain't showing up and putting beads in her stringy hair. And that's no disrespect to Becky. It's just to say that ain't how it works.
Right. So, I mean, absolutely. You're right to point out that this is precisely something that seems like it's facially neutral, that might have a disproportionate black impact on black people, right? And this is what most of the hair rules do. And in fact, that's how we got to this point with the Crown Act, is that so many of these employer grooming codes or appearance codes were interpreted as being neutral, even though they were targeting or were interpreted in a way that targeted particular kinds of hairstyles or other kinds of things that were more likely to be worn by African Americans. So absolutely, you're absolutely right there.
Akiba, I'm thinking about this 16-year-old child and the idea of having to cut her hair off, cut her braids off in public in front of these folk. She says she felt dehumanized. Some people say that's exaggerated. It's just hair. What do you say to those people?
I say that they're wrong because she was in fact dehumanized. When you make somebody cut off a part of their hair, a part of their self, because actually they're performing well on the field, and this seemed like a ploy actually to stop her because she had actually hit a double before the first complaint. And she had already played that game 4 times with that same hair. So the question becomes, number one, why was she asked to do this? And then number 2, why was she openly humiliated and given the choice between humiliating herself or continuing to play a team sport? And that is a really difficult decision to make for anybody, but particularly a 16-year-old in high school.
And this is sort of an extension of a bigger cultural issue, Akiba, around hair in general with black women and girls, right? I mean, there's a way that society never gets this right, at least not mainstream society, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's designed to never get it right. And in fact, I think it's getting it right when it discriminates against black women in our hair. It's really interesting when you see the appropriation of traditionally black hairstyles. Like you see a Kim Kardashian wearing boxer braids, quote unquote, and she's considered a fashion icon. But if a black girl walked out with cornrows straight back, she would be considered ghetto or masculine, or that her hair isn't done. And so, I believe that this is just another way to keep Black women chasing after something that we should be entitled to, which is freedom and bodily autonomy.
Absolutely. Angela, you mentioned the Crown Act, and that's an important piece of the conversation. It stands for creating respectful and open world for natural hair. That's the acronym. And it prohibits race-based hair discrimination. 11 states have already passed it. 39 have not. Are you optimistic that this will become a nationally accepted thing?
Well, I'm optimistic that it could become a federal law, in which case then it would be protected, and if someone brought a suit in federal court. I think there will be some states that will be really slow to pass it. Over time, over a longer period of time, I think eventually, as more and more states adopt the Crown Act, you're more likely to see additional states do it. But I think it'll be a long battle to do it state by state. But I think it's possible that you could have a federal Crown Act that passes within the next couple of years. Absolutely, there's support
Well,
there. And I think that, sorry.
No, I was just going to say federal courts have excluded protection against. No, it's all good. Federal courts have excluded protection against hair discrimination because they say it's a characteristic that can be changed. That also feels a bit short-sighted when it comes to thinking about black folk.
Absolutely. It's absolutely short-sighted. It misunderstands black hair. It's based on a misunderstanding of black hair by judges who don't tend to look like me and you, right? And so I think one of the things when you talk about the transparency phenomenon or privilege, right, is that if you're white, you don't have to understand different people or different experiences. You don't have to think about race. And I think what happens is a lot of people don't understand that the texture and structure of black hair is different. For most black people, is quite different. And so I think that the courts, the judges who were analyzing these very first cases, didn't have that understanding, if I'm being charitable, didn't have that understanding. And so when they looked at these cases, they thought, well, it's just hair, it's just a hairstyle. And they don't understand that when you tell black women that you can't wear your hair in braids, locks, or twists, or an afro even, right, that you're telling black women or black people implicitly that you have to change the structure and texture of your hair. And we wouldn't tell black people, for example, you have to change your nose, you have to change your skin color. And yet we do that all the time when we have grooming codes, appearance codes that are interpreted in a way or that explicitly prohibit braids, locks, and twists. We're telling black people you have to change the texture and structure of your hair, either through a chemical process or through a heat process. That your hair, as it grows out of your head naturally, as you were born with it, is not good enough. It is inherently unprofessional. And I think that there is ignorance that is involved in sort of interpreting and applying those rules in this way.
Akiba, I'll give you the last word here. One of the things that I was struck by over the last decade or so is how many institutions, sometimes black institutions, for example, some HBCUs have had business schools and other departments that have said, we want to prepare you for the real world, so we don't allow braids, we don't allow locks, we don't allow twists. In what ways is that? Is that an extension of white supremacy as well? Or is that an acceptable response to a white supremacist world?
I think it's an extension of white supremacy. I think if universities want to teach its students about how they may be penalized for how they wear their hair, then that's how they should frame it. They shouldn't be disallowing people's hair and the way it grows out of their head or the way they choose to style it to be something that is contingent upon them getting high grades or them completing their program. I think it's important to talk about what you mentioned, white supremacy, and that's a system that enforces beauty standards, it enforces housing, it enforces unequal education, et cetera, et cetera. We shouldn't be telling our black students that you need to change your hair because it's the right thing to do. We should be telling black people, here's how to prepare if you're forced to change your hair. Here are the laws that you can use to get recourse, and we're going to encourage you to wear your hair exactly how it comes out of your head.
I like that. Dean Angela Onwuachi-Willig and Akiba Solomon, thank you both for joining me. We're sure to have you back soon.